Okay, it's recording.
Recording. It's recording.
It's recording. All right. All right. So I'll get started and hope that this is being saved for posterity. I'm getting a little recording logo, so that's a good sign. Yes, it tells me it's recording. Okay. As Ellen said, I'm a professor at the WNL in the Journalism and Mass Communication department. In my former life, I was a newspaper reporter, and now, since I've been in academia, I teach and research kind of anything at the intersection between digital media and journalism. I wanted to talk first about kind of the verbiage that we use when we talk about fake news. And fake news is, if we kind of pulled everybody on this call as to their definition of fake news, we would get almost as many definitions, really, as people. And fake news as a term really came to prominence right around the time Donald Trump was elected in November of 2016. And really within about a month or two, it became fundamentally useless for people actually trying to study fake news, because those definitions that people were using were so disparate, because the term had been so diluted and so politically weaponized. So a lot of the scholars basically kind of moved away from the term fake news pretty quickly, because it was just so hard to even reclaim it to make it mean anything coherent and cohesive. Now that they're using fake news, it's more just studying how people have used that term. So the title of this talk notwithstanding, I'm actually going to avoid using the term fake news here. Because it's not particularly helpful. Everybody has their own idea of what it means. Instead, there are two terms that and concepts that researchers in this area have really kind of settled on over the past couple of years. One is called disinformation. And this is a helpful definition from the European Commission. They call it all forms of false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. So there's a lot there, but there's a couple components I want to highlight. One is the idea of false, inaccurate, or misleading information. That would include stories that are completely made up, but it also includes stories that might have elements of truth, or that might be even partly or seemingly mostly true, but ultimately are fundamentally misleading or deceptive in the framework or in the framing or the sort of the direction that they lead the audience. So it's a little bit broader than just completely made up whole cloth news. And it's also, there's a motivation element here to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. So there's the notion here. I don't know why there's drawing on my screen. I don't know if that's for everybody else, but there's a little bit of drawing on my screen here. There's the notion here that the people who are creating fake news are doing it not simply, not simply honestly. They don't necessarily come by it honestly, but there's some actual intent to kind of cause harm to the public, or simply to make money, and they really don't care if they cause harm to the public as a kind of collateral damage. That's contrasted with misinformation, which is very similar, the same sort of deceptive idea, false, inaccurate, misleading information, but it is it may cause harm without the disseminator's knowledge. So if I am talking about something that's going on at City Hall or something like that, and I heard something and I tell you and it happens to be wrong, I'm not necessarily intending to cause public harm, but I am misinforming you. And so there's a difference between that, although they end up shading together, because disinformation, the people who create disinformation might be intending harm, while the people who share it might not be. So they overlap a good bit, but those are kind of the terms that people are kind of using instead of fake news. What we've seen in fake news since 2016 is that in 2016, a lot of the stories that really got the public's attention and sort of galled the public were these blatantly whole cloth made up stories. Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump, or Tens of thousands of fraudulent Clinton votes were found in an Ohio warehouse. And these are stories that were completely made up. There's nothing in them that was, there's not even a kernel of truth. Somebody just made them up as a figment of their imaginations. And those stories have, those types of fake news have really generally decreased in prevalence. That's not something that we're seeing a whole lot of in this election cycle. And what we've seen instead is more news stories that might have little pieces of truth, or they might be making claims that can't really be verified or denied, but they end up kind of coming together to paint an ultimately decepting or misleading or false picture. So a perfect example of this during the coronavirus is the pandemic video, which went viral on Facebook within the last month or so. I am emphatically not recommending that you would check it out. I think it is, it's disinformation, and it's basically a bunk conspiracy theory. But the thing is here, it's a half-hour long documentary, quote unquote. It's a half-hour long documentary style video, in which this woman basically kind of paints a conspiracy theory about the coronavirus, and about masks and vaccines, and Tony Fauci is in on it, and the pharmaceuticals, etc. And there are little bits of fact, like this woman is real. She actually worked for Tony Fauci a long time ago, and there are kind of little facts peppered in here. But ultimately, the total picture is false and harmful to the public, and that's more like what we're seeing in 2020. As opposed to kind of these just completely made up stories. You're seeing things that take a couple pieces of true information or assertions that you just can't really say true or untrue, and ultimately the picture they paint is both false and very damaging. So what do we do about this? How do we kind of guard against this, whether it's wholly false or just misleading news in our own news consumption? I want to kind of build this around the ideas of a couple of very smart journalists turned academics named Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel. They wrote a book a decade ago. It was very useful on this front, called Blur: How to Know What's True in the Age of Information Overload. It's kind of a citizen's guide to basically making sense of news in all forms. Even though it's 10 years ago, it really holds up quite well. It applies quite well to the social media age as we know it now. They were kind of early in the social media age. And one of the big principles that they talk about in terms of consuming news is what they call the way of skeptical knowing. What they mean by that is that we should strive to kind of put away our own kind of personal biases and things that we assume we know in order to basically start at zero. And they really kind of borrowed this approach from science, that we don't assume anything unless we can sort of empirically verify it. And we question every single bit of piece of information that we get, and really take on a kind of empirical state of mind. And are really approaching things without just assuming, oh, I know this because it fits with how I believe about the world. You step all the way back at every point and are checking to see, okay, how do I know this is true? What's kind of being asserted here, and is there actually evidence to back that assertion? Now, there's two kind of sides of this. On one side, of course, is that you're questioning everything. So your skepticism is really turned up quite a bit. But they also really advocate keeping an open mind. They say that, we have the obligation to approach news with open minds, willing to accept new facts and examine new points of view as they are presented, so that we are not completely walled off from new information. The idea is, if an idea is supported by evidence and is backed up and can be understood as fact, then we can accept new facts and we can examine new points of view, again, as long as they are empirically supported, rather than just closing ourselves off on whatever we believe to be true and never adding to our knowledge about a situation. So really what this comes down to is in any news text that we're looking at, whether it's a video, a news article, something in our Facebook feed, we're really looking for evidence. And if I were to boil down their way of thinking, it is the key question is constantly asking whatever we're reading or viewing, how do you know this? How do you know this? Where can I see where you got to this conclusion? If you can't find that out, then that's not something that you assume to be true. Now, of course, this is the ideal way of doing things. And as we all know, like none of us are actually capable of starting at zero and questioning everything. None of us are actually blank slates. We all come in with preconceived notions. This is essential to how we just navigate the world every day. So I would kind of add these two addenda to the way that they approach. They talk about approaching the news. One is what I talk about is kind of flipping your skepticism around. There's a psychologist a couple of decades ago used to talk about that when our brains encounter information that fits with our way of seeing the world, the things that we already believe, our brain basically says to itself, can I believe this? They're looking for any reason they can give to be able to believe this and affirm this because it fits so well with what we already believe to be true. So we're really naturally turning our skepticism way down when it fits with our pre-existing beliefs. The flip side is when something runs counter to our pre-existing beliefs. If it sheds a negative light on someone, a politician or somebody that we view positively, our brain goes into the must I believe this mode. It's looking for any possible reason to discount whatever this information is. The skepticism goes into overdrive. And this is a pretty natural, well-documented cognitive phenomenon. So I think we need to be cognizant of that bias in our own lives. And I think of it as, in a way, kind of, understanding, flipping around when we would naturally be skeptical. So when you understand, oh, this story fits pretty well with what I would like to believe about this person or this group or something like that, understand that you are very prone to turning your skepticism down in those situations, and try to counter that or make up for that by actually turning up your skepticism, knowing that you have a bias to turn that skepticism off, and try to treat that with more skepticism. And the flip side, when you're looking for stories that you're looking for any reason to disbelieve, try to keep a more open mind than you might otherwise be predisposed to, and think about, okay, what is there anything that I can learn from this story, since I know I'm naturally inclined to not. So I think that's a way that we can start to get towards that starting at zero and work against and try to counter our own biases. Understand that we all work with these sorts of biases and try to work against it. It doesn't mean you want to change your deep pre-existing beliefs, but understanding the way your brain might be working against you getting good, solid, verified information. The second addendum I would give real quickly is to be skeptical but not cynical. For some people, the best advice is they need to be more skeptical. They're too gullible. They believe too much of what they see in their Facebook feeds. But other people, I think, have gone past skepticism into cynicism. They believe that all of the media is lying to them, that everybody is in cahoots, that everybody is just out to get clicks, and that nothing can be trusted. And you might think oh yes, I'm practicing proper skepticism, but that's cynicism. And then you've closed yourself off to learning anything from any of those sources, and you're really not doing yourself a service. So I that's almost become an increasing concern for me, is seeing people who just completely doubt anything that comes from any range of sources, and they just turn off the actual skeptical examination of facts because they're assuming terrible motives on the behalf of anyone, and you're really just keeping yourself from ever assimilating any new information from the vast majority of the world's daily knowledge producing sources. So those would be the kind of addenda that I would add. So Kovach and Rosenstiel break down a process for evaluating new information. They do 6 questions. I'm going to run through them quickly, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time just talking about some practical examples. How might this work itself out in practice when you see news content? So their first one is, what kind of content am I encountering? And they kind of go into all kinds of different types and genres of content, but I think this is a good one without going deep into that, for just getting the lay of the land and understanding, like, what is the purpose of the content that I'm encountering? Is this content pretty much meant to reaffirm my beliefs? Is this content meant to make me angry? Or is this content meant to fundamentally inform me? That sort of thing. And we'll get to a practical example of how this might work in a bit. The second is the information complete? And if not, what am I missing? And I think this is an important question because it asks us to look beyond what's actually in the article or the video and look at what's not there. Because it's easy for an article to paint sort of a fake complete process if we don't stop and think about, like, wait a second, there's some unexplained things that are just kind of glided past, and that if we started to tug at those things might unravel the whole thing. And this, I think, is a really key question in that process, is thinking about what's missing that might actually complicate this picture a little bit. The third one that they talk about is, this is one of the bread and butter things of kind of media literacy and detecting fake news, that sort of thing, is who and what are the sources and why should I believe them? We'll talk a lot more about this in a bit in the practical stuff, but this is really basic stuff. Who is telling you this? Where are they getting their information? And should I believe the things that they say? The fourth one, this is of course what I talked about earlier. What evidence is presented and how is it tested or vetted? How do you know? Just think of yourself as constantly asking that question. How do you know that? How do you know that? And the evidence that they presented, if there's a statistic, where did that poll come from? What information can you get about where, how that poll was conducted, et cetera, et cetera. So this is another core question for them. And then finally, this kind of ties back into what's missing here, is stepping back and thinking about what might be an alternative explanation or understanding. So you can take a whole bunch of facts and conclude, such and such a department in the federal government is out to get Donald Trump. And that's sort of the given, narrative of an article. But if you take a step back and you say, well, there's probably another reason, another possible explanation or way of understanding things than is presented in this particular news article. And if you can assemble the pieces in a completely different way to produce a completely different picture, and maybe all of these things are completely rational steps that involve good government and have nothing to do with animosity towards Donald Trump or something like that. But you have to be able to put those pieces together yourself. So thinking about, okay, what are ways that they are assembling this this puzzle in one way, and actually these pieces could fit together in a completely other way. Again, that's kind of a higher order thing. And then I think the highest level thing is their last question, which is, am I learning what I need to? And I think of this, the analogy I always think of is in terms of a diet, like stepping back and looking at your diet and figuring out, the analogy here would be, information is, vitamins and minerals. How many vitamins and minerals am I getting from my diet, as opposed to sugar and fat and carbohydrates? And I think that's really important beyond any one article. Am I learning the things that I need to know to make decisions as a citizen? To have informed opinions on these issues, to be able to notice when stuff is wrong or false, or misleading or something like that. And if you don't really even have the first clue of how to tell if something would be misleading, that's a sign that we've got to do a whole diet change to get more information into your media diet. So how does this look like in kind of practice? So my first tip, this is incredibly blindingly obvious, but it's amazing how often this is not practiced, is you have to actually pay attention to the sources that you're consuming. And you might say, well, yes, of course, that's a big part of it, but it's amazing how often we don't do that. And part of it is because social media makes this quite difficult. So this is when you see something in your Facebook feed, this is probably what a news article in your Facebook feed would mean. I just grabbed this off of my Facebook feed. This is something, on the armed protests at the Michigan State Capitol. And so you see somebody's angry comment about it. You see people kind of going back and forth in arguments in the comments, etc. And if I were to tell my wife about this 6 hours later and she would ask you, where did you get this from? I would probably name the friend who shared it and they said it on book. Actually the source, not where the facts came from. That's not where the information came from. And I would have no recall of that scrolling through my feed unless I really, really paid attention, because everything is just kind of flattened. All sources look the same in Facebook's ecosystem. Everything looks sort of equally credible because it's all sort of pressed into Facebook's format, when of course we know that it isn't. In this case, this is from Newsweek.com, which of course Newsweek is a very long-running, has been a very prominent news magazine, although it is barely even recognizable as the same news organization at this point. So Newsweek, knowing that it's Newsweek, is not necessarily a reason to automatically distrust it, nor is it really a sort of good housekeeping seal of approval. But the point is, Facebook makes it really hard to kind of understand and keep track of these sources as you see them in your feed. You have to do more. One thing that Facebook has added, if you see this eye at the bottom right corner of the photo, if you click on that now, you'll get a little pop-up like this that will give you some information about the source that you're seeing in Facebook. It just grabs the first couple sentences of their Wikipedia page. It also tells you how old that link is. So you can see, is this a current story or is this some 5-year-old story that keeps recirculating or something like that. So that's one little note that you can at least start with on Facebook itself to find out sources. On Twitter, it's kind of the same. You'll see it. You'll see somebody's angry comment about it. This was somebody in my Twitter feed. And Twitter gives you no resources to figure out who is the weak and what are they saying? Who is Jim Pethokoukis? And why is he saying anything about the world's first trillionaire? All I'm really going to remember is my friend's comment about it, and that some magazine called The Week made him mad on Twitter, if I even remember The Week. So we've got to do more than that. We've got to do better than that. We've got to really kind of pay attention to sources. Now, before I get into kind of finding out more about sources, a little parenthesis, which is the type of sources that we should prioritize. When I think about the am I learning what I need to guide there, I think the key here is prioritizing information-rich sources. There are a lot of different sources that could do, that really emphasize a lot of different things. There are very entertainment-heavy sources. There are very emotion-heavy sources. And I think really the best kind of sources to make sure that you're learning what you need to are information-rich sources. So a few examples, I could name many, many, and I'm going to highlight just a few really quickly. These are not going to be surprising news organizations to you because they're old and they're prominent and they're well respected for a reason. But just real quickly, a few recommendations. The New York Times is, for my money, still the best news organization all around in the United States. It gets watched a lot more closely than everybody else, so its missteps get magnified, but I think on the whole, they produce just a greater volume of quality journalism than anybody else in America. And I will give a quick shout out, if you are into podcasts at all, they have the largest news podcast in the world is the New York Times The Daily, and for my money, it's the best. It's 5 days a week, 20 to 30 minutes every weekday, explaining and breaking down or going behind some big issue or in the news or some big event or happening in the news. It's excellent kind of explanatory journalism. But the New York Times is an excellent source. The Washington Post also does outstanding work. It has really actually improved over the past 5 years, which is quite rare for a news organization. NPR is another one that you really can't go wrong with. Its member stations do great work as well. I would put most all of public media in there as well. PBS is a smaller news gathering organization, but I think they're very trustworthy. On international news, there's plenty of sources. It really depends on what part of the world, but the BBC, I think, is still the standard for international news in many parts of the world. Again, it has its flaws. It gets watched very closely, but I think on the whole, it's a good source. The Wall Street Journal, I think, on financial economic news is still probably the gold standard as well. So in that particular area, I think it's very good. And then ProPublica is another one that's a newer organization. It's been around since the mid 2000s, and there are a lot of ProPublica is a nonprofit organization that does exclusively investigative journalism, a lot of deep dive stuff. They've won a lot of Pulitzers doing like public interest watchdog type reporting. And there are a lot of kind of local organizations that are new, but are built, nonprofit organizations built on that model. And they may not have a lot of name recognition because they're new and they're small and they run on a pretty lean budget, but they do really, really good work, usually on issues of public interest, on government waste and corruption and fraud and corporate fraud, that sort of thing. And then the final one I would mention is local news organizations. If there, and this is especially for kind of geographically based stories, if there's some sort of coronavirus outbreak in the Dallas area, your best source is probably the Dallas Morning News. Now, and it's going to be the local newspaper in whatever town you're in. Now, those local newspapers are an absolute shell of what they were 15 years ago. They are barely a shadow of themselves, but they are still the ones with the best knowledge of their own backyard. So whenever there's something that's going on locally, if there's a mass shooting somewhere or something like that, I'm immediately searching for the local newspaper that's closest to that area, because they're the ones that know their area the best. Some of them are really pretty poor, but they're still better than a lot of national sources on very locally based sources. What you will not find here is notably cable news. I would not qualify that as information rich at all. I would call that opinion rich and emotion rich and bloviation and bluster rich. But I think if we're going to the diet analogy, that's like a diet of Peeps. You know, some forms of local TV and network TV can occasionally be helpful, but on the whole, you know, I think really your more text-based or audio-based sources do much better. Okay, so back to kind of evaluating sources. Say you get this, you come across this story, you click on it in your Facebook feed, and you have this headline: California pastor defends decision after defying lockdown, holding church service where 180 are possibly exposed to the coronavirus. This story is from the New York Daily News, which, if you've looked up your source and examined it, it's a very old New York tabloid. And before I even examine the story, the first thing that kind of seems a little bit weird to me is that this is a story about California, and the source is the New York Daily News. And you stop and ask yourself, how would a reporter from the New York Daily News know what's going on with the California pastor? Well, there's a couple ways. They may have reporters in California. The New York Times has plenty of reporters in California. Knowing that the New York Daily News is a more New York City focused paper, it's probably unlikely that they have a reporter in California. But if they do, you would get some indication that they were there. They may also have just called somebody from California and they've talked to them. At least they can do that from home or from New York City or something like that. In which case, again, that would be kind of indicated in the story. Or if it's neither of those two, they've basically just gotten it from other media sources. They've gotten it from, you know, some local media source or social media or press release or some combination thereof. But the key here is that that way of knowing should be in the text. It should be indicated. You should be able to kind of use the textual clues to figure out where they got this information. And immediately, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical about a story about California from the New York Daily News. Well, if I look at the story, what you find here is the only source cited in the story. This isn't the whole source, this story, but this is most of the sources, are the LA Times. And then in the middle there's a press release. So in fact, they don't have a reporter in California. They didn't talk to anybody in the story. They just got this from the LA Times. Now, the key here is, why would you like read or trust or share this New York Daily News story when you could just go click on the LA Times story? And that's a really important step, I think, in understanding what's going on with the story, is not playing a game of telephone, where every single time you're 1 degree further from the story, where it's a source citing another source citing another source. There's more opportunity for something to get garbled or lost in translation. So fortunately here, we've got a link. We can go to the LA Times story, and if you read through the story, it's actually quite a good story. It's pretty comprehensive. They actually called the pastor. They talked to the pastor. They talked to local health officials. They've really contextualized it and put a lot of the pieces together. And there was nothing fake about the New York Daily News story. It was just pretty superficial, and it just kind of rewrote the story, only didn't include the depth or context. And if you're gonna like base your understanding of the issue off a story or share a story, just share the LA Times story. Try to get closer to the information. So that would be one tip in sort of understanding the source, is learning to kind of read in the text, where did they get this from? And then click through to an original source. And if you can't tell from the text where they got that information from, then I would sort of run screaming from that story. If I can't tell how you know where that evidence comes from, then I'm just not going to consider that a trustworthy account. Another key is to read laterally, and by this I mean find other sources that can help provide information about the source that you're talking about. So, for example, this is an article that I ran across at a site called Just the News, and this is about the unmasking of Michael Flynn by Obama officials, Joe Biden, et cetera, Jim Comey. This is a big sort of kind of played up scandal over the past couple weeks in conservative media. If I run across this, there's a couple things that I need to know. One is, what the heck is Just the News? I had never heard of this organization before I clicked on the story. The other is there anything to this story? We're going to look in the text and see if there's evidence. The problem is, if we just look deeper into this story, Just the News' about page may not be very good, or it may be hard to find. Or they may not be the most reliable narrator about who they are and what they're about. So you need to go outside of this source to really be able to find out what you need to know about this source. So I did this just by really quickly, just doing a quick Google search. I put quotes around Just the News so I can get just references to that particular phrase. And on the first page of results, I got a press release about the founding of Just the News, and it was in January. So it's only a 4-month-old website, which that's a not necessarily disqualifying, but it's a little bit of a red flag. And I find that it's actually founded by a journalist named John Solomon, which that name may ring a bell to some of you. It immediately rung a bell to me. Whether it rings a bell or not, your next step would be figure out who John Solomon is and what he's all about. And I just plugged his name into Wikipedia. I knew he was prominent enough that he'd have a page, and Wikipedia catches a bad rap, but I think it's actually a pretty good place to go just to get the lay of the land on somebody, a person or an organization or something like that. And you can always do a deep dive somewhere else, but it's actually pretty good for a basic overview. So John Solomon's Wikipedia page, the key paragraph is right there in the second paragraph. It says, during the presidency of Donald Trump, he has been advancing Trump-friendly stories and played an important role in advancing conspiracy theories about wrongdoing involving Joe Biden, his son Hunter, and Ukraine. Solomon's stories about the Bidens influenced Trump to request that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky launch an investigation into the elder Biden, which led to an impeachment inquiry. So if his name was ringing a bell, this is why. He was being talked about a ton last fall during the impeachment inquiry, because he was writing all these columns for an organization called The Hill, basically lobbing all these accusations about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden in Ukraine with the gas company. And those columns found their way to Trump, and that's what prompted Trump to start pressing Vladimir Zelensky and got the whole impeachment inquiry going. So he actually got sort of unceremoniously dumped by The Hill and then went and founded his own organization, Just the News. So this pretty much tells me most everything I need to know about Just the News. This is not an organization I can really expect to literally give me Just the News and to be interested in telling me kind of a verified account of what's going on in and around the Trump administration. I'm expecting this to basically be a pro-Trump site based on this guy's backstory. So this is not a place that I'm really going to go to trust to get this story. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the story itself was wrong. So I need to do some lateral reading about this story itself. and the assertions in it. So I just did a quick Google search with just some of the keywords, even from the headline. And I scroll down until I get a source that I like, or not, I shouldn't say like, a source that I trust and find credible, and that would be the New York Times. And so this is a New York Times story on basically the exact same story from the exact same time. And it's a straight news story that talks about these unmasking, but gives a lot more context and a lot more depth and is a lot more breathless. And again, leaves room for potential explanations, alternate explanations, as opposed to Obama scandal. And so fundamentally, again, the Just the News story was not necessarily fake news. There was nothing in it that was false. It was just kind of framed as an Obama scandal, as opposed to just presenting evidence with context, which New York Times could do a lot better. So that's the benefit of reading laterally, both around a source and around the information in the story. You'll note, just to mention here, in that Google search, the first result that Google gave me was a Wall Street Journal story. Now, I had previously talked about the Wall Street Journal as a potential trustworthy source. I look at their headline and it says Team Obama's unmasking Dodge. And sort of the calculus that I make before deciding whether to click is, could I possibly imagine this headline being on top of a very straight, informative, contextualized news story? No, that's pretty hard for me to imagine. I pretty immediately sort of guessed or deduced this is probably an opinion column in the Wall Street Journal that Google decided to pop up. Even though the Wall Street Journal is a trustworthy source, that's not really what I'm looking for if I want to know the basics of the situation. And sure enough, if I click on it, it is an opinion, it's an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal, to their credit, they do label opinion very clearly. You can see opinion at the top, opinion right above the column, and then on the byline, it says it's from the editorial board. The Wall Street Journal's editorial board is quite conservative. And this is basically kind of the conservative read on this situation. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with opinion. I think opinion can be really helpful in giving us ways to think about issues, but opinion's top priority is not to make sure that I'm learning what I need to, and to give me the information that I need to get my arms around a story and to present verified claims. So I think it's really important to know when you're reading news and when you're reading opinion. Good organizations will label those distinctly. It can be hard to find them or hard to read them, but again, understand what you're coming at. Opinion has its usefulness, but if your goal is to understand information that is, and make sure that it's presenting evidence that is giving you a whole contextualized opinion, a whole contextualized approach to that, it's going to be a little bit harder to find that in an opinion article. And so my level of skepticism is a little bit higher for opinion work. And again, you just need to understand the difference between those as you're reading it. And then lastly, I would also say to beware of images and video. We are kind of conditioned to think about images and video as like the final word. If there's videotape, that means it happened, but it has become incredibly easy on, Photoshop or, Movie Maker or wherever to doctor any sort of images or video. So you can make, we're talking fake video, fake audio, fake images. This is a fake tweet by Donald Trump, all kinds of stuff. I would go so far as to say, I pretty much will not share any photo or video unless I have some sort of external corroboration that that is real, legit, verified video. So don't be fooled by the sort of realness that video and images seem. It is extremely easy to make really, really realistic looking fakes. And so finally, I would also note that I would put an extra burden on anything that you share. And really don't share anything on social media unless you have gone through this process. You feel really confident about the source, about the evidence presented, and about whether that evidence supports the claims that are actually being made in that article. Because the last thing that I would ever want to do is actually become a vector for misinformation in my enthusiasm, because this just fits, whatever my view is about the world. So I'm actually I'm very hesitant to share things on social media because as soon as I share them, my name's going on that too. And I have to have a pretty high level of trust, and I really don't ever want to be caught making somebody less informed about the world because of the things that I'm sharing. So those are a few of my general tips, kind of based on those ideas that I talked about from Covich and Rosenstiel. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have. I'm going to stop the screen share here and take your questions. Yeah, Ellen.
Mark, thanks so much. That is fantastic and confirms some things for me and introduces a bunch of new stuff too. One of the things I find challenging, especially in social media, which for me is mostly Facebook, is the scrolling thing where you're not going to click and you're not going to read the article, but you read the headline.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if there's some advice you can give the lazy reader like myself, um, about interpreting headlines.
Mm.
I actually am a notoriously bad headline reader because I want a verb to be a noun in the headline or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm already reading it off. And it seems to me that if we could be even more cautious headline readers,
Yes.
or is the answer simply go find out the full news piece?
Yeah, it's hard because I mean I wouldn't call you lazy. I mean there's just so many headlines that we're kind of just saving cognitive energy. Like you don't have time to go click through every single story. So there is a sense in which we necessarily, you know, we necessarily have to kind of parse headlines. I would say though that if it matters to you enough that you're going to like form your understanding of some happening or something, then you probably need to go through and actually read the story. I've caught myself with that with the coronavirus a lot in the past month or two. Like my wife and I will tell each other about stories, and then I'll be like, you know, I'll tell her something like, "Oh, did you hear Trump did such and such?" And she's just like, "Yeah, when did that happen?" And I'll be like, "I just read the headline." And then it'll be like, "Well, if it was important enough to tell my wife and note it to her, it was important enough to click through to the story, you know." And I'll catch myself. And so there are some things that I just don't care enough to quite, I just kind of register, like, I'll see some story, whatever, Florida cases have not really gone up yet. Okay, well that doesn't really change my world. I don't, that's just noted, there's nothing, in my opinion, of anybody is not really going to change as a result of that. So yeah, I can scroll through, but if it's something that it's like, I actually, this is something that I might find notable, then I feel like I have to stop myself and check, like, I can't just rely on a headline,
Yeah.
to do that. So I can't really give you any tips for parsing headlines other than just beware. And just know this is something that everybody in the news industry knows, and I feel like it's kind of hit and miss as to people outside the news industry know it, that very often the people who write the stories don't write the headlines. And that goes for opinion columns too. That especially goes for opinion columns. And so there might be really incendiary headlines that get people really angry. And then when you read the opinion column, you're just like, oh, well, that was very tempered and very nuanced, and then you feel sorry for the writer because they didn't write the headline. So other than just beware, and if you really care, read the whole story is probably the main tip that I'd have.
Thank you.
Yeah, Stephanie.
I often go to Snopes. I'm wondering what you think of Snopes.
I think Snopes is generally a pretty good source, especially for like urban legends and those sorts of things. Is particularly because they show their work, they document it. I'm also a little bit biased because Snopes is now led by a journalism PhD, and so I like an academic in my field running Snopes. That makes me happy. There are things that Snopes has debunked where I could tell like they're just getting a little bit catty about things, and it's just a little bit like, come on, this was clearly satirical, that sort of thing. And as long as but those things I'm not actually checking for truth. It's more just because I don't know, I just don't really like the tone of, that sort of thing. But I don't think I've ever really seen Snopes say that something was well, this really checks out, and it turned out it didn't. Like, I think they're pretty meticulous about stuff, and again, they show their work, which is a key part. Yeah, Tinny.
You had said about Newsweek that that was, if I saw a source that said Newsweek or US News, those are sort of old magazines, old newspapers, and my instinct is to trust them. But sometimes I'll read things on there which just seem bizarre.
Yeah.
So how do you figure out how a newspaper has evolved to become less reputable or more reputable? Is there a site we can go to figure
That's a great question. I have not really found any sort of site, and it's hard for me. I feel like I've cheated because I just follow the industry so closely. I've like never had to like go look, you know. And there's been people who have like tried to develop, you know, kind of I know NewsGuard is a like browser plugin that they've worked with Microsoft, and they've got some heavy hitters in the industry. I'm just skeptical of anything that like has some sort of rating system or something like that, because I just think it's a lot more subjective than that. Honestly, if I'm trying to remember like what's this organization up to, like I said, my first place to go is Wikipedia, and the thing I'm looking for on Wikipedia is ownership. That's the big one. Like, I mean, you can pretty much trace the decline of Newsweek by tracing all the ways it's changed hands. And, you know, obviously for insiders, they might know a lot more about ownership. Like if we see some, you know, company or organization, we go, whoa, man, those guys are, you know, those guys are huge cost cutters, you know, or something like that. But even like Newsweek, if you look at, you know, like it used to be owned by the Washington Post company, you know, or the Graham Holdings, which is, you know, part of the same parent organization. Like we generally know that's pretty reputable. And then it got caught up with some guy who was like kind of almost running a cult, and it was very strange. And like that all, I haven't looked up their Wikipedia page, but my guess is if you started looking up on Newsweek on Wikipedia, you'd pretty quickly get down that rabbit hole, and you start to realize like, whoa, this is not the Wikipedia I remember. You know, something like that. So honestly, like Wikipedia as a starting place may be the best, you know, best place to go. There are also a couple of media sites that are, again, a little bit more insidery, but if anything major has happened to an organization, they might be expected to write about it. The Columbia Journalism Review is a kind of classic news organization that covers the media industry, and they'll write about that stuff. And then Neiman Journalism Lab, which is run out of Harvard, and which I contribute there, and they're a little bit more like digitally focused. So newer news organizations, they often write profiles of them, so you can get a feel for, or if they've changed hands or something like that. So if you want to go a little bit more in depth, I would look at those two organizations. But honestly, just look at Wikipedia and see what their ownership is like, and then go and see if you have real issues with the owner, and that might give you a little bit of an indication.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I saw Gretchen's hand was
right.
raised.
So my question is probably too broad for you to answer, but as I was listening to this, I was thinking about two things. One was, well, the overarching thing, I was thinking about how hard it is to battle this phenomenon of fake news and people being so interested in fake news. So it feels to me like there are two driving forces here. One is money, because like you were saying, the headlines get written by, I assume, the owners, the publishers, the people trying to make the money versus the journalists. And there does seem to be a really strong push, at least in our country, to want these fake stories to be true. At least people that I encounter in my day-to-day life seem to desperately want these things to be true. So I am just wondering how in the world of journalism, I mean, my dad was, he was what you call a newspaper man back before there was journalism, right? He was a writer for the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and it's just a totally different world. And how does journalism fight this battle and win it? I mean, is it even possible?
I don't know. That's like the existential question for like
Yeah,
our entire field. That's what we wrestle with, like just teaching our students, you know, how do we send students into this well-equipped to fight a battle that it feels like they're destined to lose, you know? I think about sometimes the fake news problem as you kind of alluded to it here, as a demand side versus a supply side problem. And a lot of early on in the fake news fight, and generally we've approached it as a supply side problem. If we just cut off the supply, then fake news will just kind of go away as a problem. And they've actually done a decent job of cutting off the supply of certain types. Again, cutting off ad revenue for known fake news sites, and cutting it off in people's feeds. Not, Facebook has been really aggressive about the pandemic video, taking down copies of the video, et cetera, et cetera. And that can only go so far, because I think ultimately, as you said, it's a demand side problem. Even if you cut off the supply, there's so much demand for things that aren't true but fit my pre-existing beliefs, that the supply is just going to create itself, because the demand is so overwhelming. People so badly want it. And people say they want just the news, but it turns out when we report just the news, inevitably the news doesn't flatter the people that we idolize. And the news tells us, it complicates things, and it tells us things that we would rather not know about the world. And so people don't actually, they say they want just the news, but they really often don't. And so I honestly don't know. It does feel right now like a losing battle. But I can tell you, at least in our program, we can, like, even if people don't most people don't on the deepest level really want verified, checked information that kind of takes no prisoners and will hold anybody and everybody to account. That's what our democracy desperately needs. That's what we need. And I think there are people, I shouldn't exaggerate, like there are a lot of people out there who want it and who will support that financially. Those are a lot of people behind that are funding a lot of these nonprofit investigative outlets. They're seeing the value to it. And if we can just teach our students how to produce that stuff, and also how to think creatively about ways to get that into audiences' hands in a way that they find interesting and will click on it, when it runs through their Facebook and Twitter feed. The problem is that type of journalism is expensive. So this is my subscribe to a news organization today, or donate to a nonprofit pitch, because that information is so important, and it feels like it's kind of fighting a losing battle.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I have another question. Sort of, it feels as though journalists these days have a really hard job and are being held to new standards, new higher standards all the time. Do you share that feeling, or do you think the job is pretty much what it always was, but you're just working in a more fraught environment?
No, I think it's harder. It's definitely harder. And if the job was, I think there's aspects about journalistic culture that have stayed the same. Like journalists as a tribe, as a professional group, are more like their 2000 selves than they are different. There are things that have changed. And I think their attitudes towards their audiences is changing a little bit. That sort of thing with social media, as they're kind of more confronted by their audiences. But certainly I think the job is much tougher for a variety of reasons. One, there's just fewer of them now. So they're just being asked to do more with less, a lot of them. And it's just kind of a crazy job to just like produce a definitive account of a news event in a day. Like those of us who are academics who are used to going through peer review, like we wouldn't dare to put something out in less than like 3 months, 6 months, a year. They get a day, and then they got to do it again and again and again and again. And what happens when one story a day turns into 3 stories a day? Like you're going to get stuff wrong, they're just human. And there's also just so much more competition for attention. And so they can't just assume that people are going to read it because we're the local newspaper. And of course, this is what they read. You just have to work overtime to like really grab people's attention, as opposed to Candy Crush, it's really, really hard. How is news going to win over Candy Crush? How, and so yeah, it's a lot more difficult. That's, yeah, that's the kind of the hard reality that I'm coming up against all the time in my research. It's just a really, really hard job in a lot of different ways, and it's getting harder.
There's time for maybe one last question if people.
Yeah, Tinny.
Can you comment on this idea? And I'm unable to evaluate it because of my biases, but can you comment on the idea that the media is biased toward liberals?
Yeah, sure. So I actually teach a spring term course called Media Bias Beyond Right and Left. And the very first thing I tell my students in that class is that I kind of borrow this from a prominent media commentator who says the idea of media bias isn't just dumb, it is the rare idea that actively makes us dumber the more we think about it. And I actually think that's true, even though I devote a whole class to it. I basically call it media bias to get students to register for it. And then it's basically like the sociology of political journalism, but nobody would sign up for that as a spring term class. So basically, the conservative critique that media is sort of biased against conservatives. A lot of the evidence that they will use for that is like surveys that have been done about members of the media, and surveys of members of the media that finds that overwhelmingly they vote for Democrats, which is stipulated. We know this, but it's another jump beyond that to assume that individual journalists have the greatest amount of influence on any content that comes up, and in fact, what we've seen over and over and over and over from research, and just one of the like core points that I hope anybody who takes my media bias class still remembers, is that like the predominant force in journalism culture is the notion of professionalism, and the notion of journalists as professionals who are and especially core to that is the notion of objectivity, as fraught as that notion is, that basically many journalists find it so anathema to let any sort of political leanings, influence the way they're covering things, that many times they overcompensate. And not only that, but for them, they're so socialized into a culture of independence and autonomy from political interests, especially, and from ownership, that really that sort of culture kind of subsumes the individual. It's much greater than any individual bias. So if you think of if any individual bias might be pushing a reporter left because they personally are a Democrat, that's like has this much influence on what the journalists produce. And the value of professionalism, I must stay neutral, I must not be beholden to any side, has like this much influence on how a journalist produce content. So conservatives tend to focus on this little bit, which is journalists are liberals, therefore they coddle liberals and write mean stories about conservatives. When in actuality, journalists are first and foremost, they see themselves and try to act as professionals. Which means part of their professional ethos is really like being against government corruption. That's a big part of it. And like, guess who is the most corrupt sort of branch of government or party of government right now? It's Republicans, and it's not close, and so like that, if you're analyzing content, like, are there more stories right now about corruption among Republicans or among Democrats? Republicans by a lot, because they hold the power, and there's when you uncover, there's just more to be dug up there. But that's not, it's too easy and not really helpful to just draw those lines and say, oh, journalists are Democrats, and most stories right now are about Republican corruption. That's just, again, where is an alternate explanation? And it just doesn't actually really hold up. That the fundamental value is this sort of professional culture of we are kind of these autonomous crusaders for truth, pushing against an ultimately corrupt sort of power structure or something like that, and really kind of working for the common man. And we're gonna push back against whoever's in power, and we're gonna try to bend over backwards to really push back against both sides, even regardless of whether or not it's merited. So I don't know. That's like the 5-minute sort of case against that. I don't know if that made sense, but
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you many times over, and thank you for your patience and moving formats. We really appreciate it. Snaps and claps and all that good stuff. And I guess we'll check with you before we post the recording on the 50 Ways page. But
Okay.
thanks very much for being willing to have it recorded.
Thanks so
and I
much.
hope-
Thank you,
yeah, and
Mark.
given all the problems we had with given all the problems we had with the Facebook Live, good luck getting the recording to post on Facebook's page.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thanks for everybody who attended. Thanks for coming over from Facebook. And so.
Yes, and
Thank
John
you.
and Ann for setting up Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Kenny. Bye.
Have a good night, guys.
Mhm.
Thanks.